Okay, let's unpack this. We're diving deep into the sources you've shared with us, zeroing in on William McKinley, his life, his presidency, and, well, that really tragic, pivotal moment that cut it short.
Yeah, absolutely.
Our mission here, always, is to be your guides through this material, to pull out the absolute most important nuggets of knowledge and insight. So you get a shortcut to being truly well-informed about a figure who sits right at a massive turning point in American history.
And what's particularly fascinating, based on these sources you've provided, is that they give us the familiar story of McKinley, the classic rise through politics, presiding over a time of huge economic change and national expansion.
Right.
But then, intriguingly, they also introduce the idea, sort of hinting at potential unseen forces or maybe hidden agendas that might have been shaping these very same events.
Absolutely. It forces you to look beyond the surface narrative, doesn't it?
It really does.
We're going to trace his path from a small town in Ohio all the way to the White House, walk through the key moments of his time in office, delve into the shocking events of his assassination, and grapple with the complex legacy he left behind.
Get ready for some surprising facts and hopefully some fresh insights.
All right, let's start at the very beginning, the making of the man.
Okay.
William McKinley Jr. was born back on January 29, 1843, in Niles, Ohio. His family had roots in the iron-making industry, English and Scots-Irish background, and their strong Methodist faith was clearly a major influence.
That Methodist upbringing and, the abolitionist leanings common in that part of Ohio, that definitely shaped his early moral compass. Got his early education at Pullen Seminary and Allegheny College, but I think financial trouble kept him from finishing. He even did a brief stint as a teacher before, well, the defining event for his generation called him the Civil War.
Right. And he didn't just, get handed a commission. He enlisted as a private in the 23rd Ohio Infantry.
Yeah, started right at the bottom.
Showed incredible bravery pretty early on, including during the intense fighting at Antietam. And here's where a key relationship forms. He was mentored by his commanding officer, none other than future President Rutherford B. Hayes.
That's a crucial connection. And he rose through the ranks through merit, leaving the service as a brevet major.
A brevet major, essentially a temporary or honorary promotion, right? For exceptional service, but maybe not the full rank and pay initially.
Exactly. It's a fascinating detail that he started as an enlisted man and rose like that. Yeah. After the war, he transitioned to law, studied, briefly attended Albany Law School, passed the bar in '67.
Okay.
He set up practice in Canton, Ohio, and pretty quickly got involved in politics, campaigning for Hayes, and getting elected prosecuting attorney.
And his personal life also entered a really significant phase around then. He married Ida Saxton in January 1871. But their marriage was marked by just profound tragedy. The loss of their two young daughters, Catherine and then baby Ida, really early in their lives.
So sad. And Ida never fully recovered her health, suffering from depression and epilepsy. And the sources consistently highlight McKinley's extraordinary, just unwavering devotion to her, especially given her struggles.
That devotion is a really striking and consistent part of his story.
It really is.
And speaking of crucial moments and connections, a pivotal event early in his law career was the 1876 coal miners case.
Oh, yeah, that one's important.
He defended a group of striking miners pro bono, meaning for free, after a violent clash with strikebreakers. He actually managed to get acquittals for most of them.
And that was huge. It raised his standing significantly with labor voters in his home county. Crucially, though, it's where he met Mark Hanna.
Who was one of the mine owners then.
Exactly. Kind of ironic, isn't it? Defending striking workers against the owners and meeting the man who would become his most powerful supporter and friend.
Absolutely pivotal, you're right.
Yeah.
And that meeting kind of launches us into his ascent through politics. He enters Congress in 1876, and from day one, he becomes the face of protective tariffs. He saw them as absolutely essential for American industry, for protecting American jobs.
That famous quote, "Buy where you can pay the easiest," sounds simple, but his argument was that tariffs made it easiest to pay here, supporting our own workers and factories.
Makes sense. Now, on the currency question, which was the other huge economic debate, gold versus silver, your sources describe his initial position as being a bit of a straddlebug.
Yeah, that's a great term. He seemed to favor bimetallism, using both gold and silver, but only if there was an international agreement. He even voted against his old mentor, President Hayes, on the Bland-Allison Act, which mandated silver purchases.
Right, showing he was his own man on policy. He quickly moved up, joining the powerful House Ways and Means Committee.
Which handles all the tax and tariff stuff.
Exactly. He became a major player in Ohio Republican politics alongside figures like John Sherman, a longtime senator, and Joseph Foraker.
And his relationship with Mark Hanna, initially just a wealthy supporter, really solidified into a close friendship and political partnership after Hanna had a falling out with Foraker at the 1888 Republican Convention.
Ah, okay. And McKinley chaired that Ways and Means Committee, guiding his signature legislation, the McKinley Tariff of 1890, through Congress. That bill significantly raised tariff rates.
It sure did. But here's where things get interesting, a bit of a setback. The impact of that tariff, which opponents blamed for rising prices.
Yeah, the stories about expensive tinware from fig peddlers.
Right. That, combined with some strategic gerrymandering by the Democrats in Ohio, cost him his seat in 1890.
Gerrymandering, of course, redrawing districts to favor one party.
Yep. And he lost by just 300 votes. Tiny margin.
Remarkable. But he bounced back. He ran for governor of Ohio and won, serving from 1892 to 1896, where he actually took a more moderate approach than maybe his tariff reputation suggested.
He did. And then came this significant personal crisis, over $100,000 in debt, because he'd guaranteed loans for a friend whose business failed. I mean, a huge sum back then.
It could have ended his career, easily.
Absolutely. But here's a fascinating twist from the sources. Instead of destroying him, this crisis actually seemed to help him politically.
How so?
Well, wealthy supporters like Mark Hanna and H.H. Colescott stepped in, quietly set up a fund to pay off the debt. And during the hard economic times of the Panic of 1893, average people felt, some sympathy for him being in such a financial bind himself. It seemed to boost his popularity, strangely enough.
Yeah, it showed a vulnerability that maybe resonated. He was easily re-elected governor in 1893 and worked strategically to secure peace within the Ohio Republican Party, supporting figures like Bushnell and Foraker.
Which really smoothed his path for a national run.
And that national run brings us to the absolutely pivotal election of 1896.
The big one.
Mark Hanna's role here simply cannot be overstated. His money, his incredible organizational skills, working tirelessly behind the scenes for years to build support for McKinley's presidential bid.
Oh, Hanna was the architect. By the time of the Republican Convention in St. Louis in June 1896, his work meant McKinley already had more than enough delegates locked up before it even started.
And McKinley famously stayed home in Canton, hearing his nomination speech delivered over the telephone. Pretty cutting-edge stuff for 1896.
It really was. The choice for vice president was Garrett Hobart. Hanna largely made that call.
Okay.
Hobart was a wealthy lawyer from New Jersey, not a big national name, but seen as a safe, respectable choice who wouldn't rock the boat and could be a valuable advisor, which sources say he was.
Now, the campaigns themselves were just a stark contrast. William Jennings Bryan, the fiery orator nominated by the Democrats.
The boy orator of the Platte.
He launched this completely unprecedented whistle-stop train tour, traveling thousands of miles, giving hundreds of speeches, connecting directly with voters in a way no one had before.
Just relentless energy. While McKinley ran what became his legendary front porch campaign from his home in Canton.
Right. Delegations from all over the country would come to him, often with travel subsidized by the campaign.
Hanna's money at work there.
And he would deliver these carefully prepared, scripted speeches on key issues right from his front porch.
It sounds passive, maybe, but it was actually a brilliant controlled strategy. Minimized gaffes, kept the message highly consistent, and the dominant issue wasn't what McKinley initially thought he expected: tariffs.
But it was the currency question, right?
Absolutely. The debate between the gold standard and coining free silver, that dominated everything.
McKinley's platform ultimately came down firmly for the gold standard, though it kept the door open a crack for international bimetallism if other major nations agreed.
Right, and both sides just saturated the country with campaign literature. Millions and millions of pamphlets explaining the gold standard or free silver were handed out. It was an education campaign on a massive scale.
On Election Day, McKinley won a clear victory, swept the entire Northeast and Midwest, appealed strongly to urban and industrialized voters, got 51% of the popular vote, and a comfortable electoral college majority.
And this election is seen by historians as a realigning election. It fundamentally shifted American politics, cementing Republican dominance for decades, especially in those industrial states.
Established what's called the fourth party system.
Exactly, and ended the kind of post-Civil War stalemate of the third-party system. A massive political earthquake, really.
Okay, so let's move into his presidency, a period of significant expansion for the country, major policy decisions, and where some sources hint at certain shadows or unseen forces. He was inaugurated March 4th, 1897. Early on, he focused on tariff reform, signing the Dingley Tariff, and he issued a strong statement against foreign entanglement, saying, "We want no wars of conquest."
Trying to set a tone. His cabinet included capable people, though Russell A. Alger at the War Department proved, let's say, less effective once war actually came.
Right.
Vice President Hobart, even though he didn't attend formal cabinet meetings, was indeed a close and valued advisor. And George B. Cortelyou, his personal secretary, was incredibly efficient. Basically, a chief of staff and press secretary rolled into one long before those roles were formally defined.
Then came the escalating crisis in Cuba and the events that led directly to war with Spain. The USS Maine was sent to Havana Harbor, ostensibly to protect American interests.
And its explosion on February 15th, 1898, killing 266 sailors that just ignited a firestorm of public anger and calls for war. Remember the Maine.
Exactly. The U.S. Navy's Court of Inquiry concluded the Maine was blown up by an underwater mine, which dramatically increased pressure on McKinley and Congress.
Though Spain always denied it, and the cause is still debated by some historians today.
True. McKinley did try to continue negotiations for Cuban independence, reflecting what some sources describe as his values of, arbitration and self-restraint.
Trying to avoid war if possible. But ultimately, he deferred to Congress on April 11th, and Congress declared war on April 20th, notably including the Teller Amendment.
Which promised the U.S. would not annex Cuba. An important point.
Very. Now, here's where one of your sources, the one referred to as the veiled presidency, throws a fascinating curveball.
Okay.
It doesn't state conclusions, but it asks these really pointed questions that force you to look beyond the surface narrative. Like, it asks if the Maine explosion wasn't just a tragedy, but maybe a conveniently timed catalyst, allowing deeper geopolitical ambitions to unfold.
That's a striking question.
Yeah.
And this source also asked whether the Spanish-American War was truly fought solely for Cuban liberation, or if it was perhaps a strategic maneuver to acquire new territories driven by unspoken motives.
Yeah, and it raises similar questions about the annexation of the Philippines. McKinley publicly spoke of it as a moral duty, educating and Christianizing.
Uplifting them.
Right. But this source asks whether it perhaps served powerful commercial interests or an unwritten doctrine of imperial expansion. It's important we frame these as the intriguing questions the source is asking, prompting us to consider alternative interpretations.
Absolutely. It's about exploring different lenses. Regardless of the underlying motivations historians still debate, the outcome of the war and the Treaty of Paris, signed in December 1898, were undeniable.
Right. The U.S. acquired Puerto Rico and Guam, Spain relinquished Cuba, and Spain ceded the Philippines to the U.S. for $20 million. Getting that treaty through the Senate was tough, though. Required significant lobbying by McKinley and Hobart.
And right in the middle of the war, McKinley also pushed for the annexation of Hawaii.
Yes. He supported it, seeing its strategic value during the war, especially for naval bases, and believing in a kind of manifest destiny for the U.S. in the Pacific.
Anticipating difficulty getting a treaty through the Senate, it was achieved via a joint resolution of Congress, the Newlands Resolution, signed in July 1898.
A different path to the same goal. On economic policy, after his attempt at international bimetallism failed, he fully committed to the gold standard, signing the Gold Standard Act in 1900.
And it's noted in the sources that the return of prosperity after the Panic of 1893, plus new gold discoveries like in the Yukon, helped reduce the political pressure for free silver that had dominated 1896.
The economic conditions kind of shifted the debate. But again, this same source, the veiled presidency, makes you pause and ask about the forces behind this economic shift too. It asks if it was really just about sound policy and natural growth, or were powerful industrialists and financiers subtly shaping government policy to build what it calls an unseen architecture of power. It really encourages critical thinking about who benefits and who influences policy.
It does. When we look at civil rights during his presidency, there were initial hopes among Black Americans after his election in '96. He had spoken out against lynching before.
Right. But his primary focus as president seemed to be national reconciliation, ending those sectional divisions between North and South left over from the Civil War.
And this focus meant he made fewer appointments of Black Americans to federal positions compared to previous Republican administrations.
Yeah, a definite pullback there. And controversially, he refused to send federal aid or troops despite urgent requests after the violent white supremacist insurrection in Wilmington, North Carolina in 1898, where elected black officials were literally overthrown.
That's a shocking event.
It is. While his tour of the South was warmly received by white Southerners, promoting reconciliation, it largely ignored racial violence and left many black citizens feeling abandoned, alienated. The view presented is that he lacked vision or maybe courage on racial issues.
A truly complex part of his legacy. Now let's turn to the final years of his presidency and the events leading to his tragic death.
Okay.
In the 1900 election, he ran against William Jennings Bryan for the second time, this time campaigning heavily on the prosperity and victory achieved during his first term. 4 more years of the full dinner pail.
Exactly. The issues had shifted somewhat from '96. While silver was still around, the focus was more squarely on the economy, and the war's outcome, imperialism, became a big talking point for Bryan.
And a major question for the Republicans was selecting a new vice president, as Garrett Hobart had died in office in 1899.
Yeah, that left an opening. And Theodore Roosevelt, fresh off his Rough Riders fame and elected governor of New York, was the clear rising star. The obvious, yet controversial, choice.
Controversial because figures like Mark Hanna strongly opposed him.
Oh, yeah. Hanna viewed him as far too impulsive, too unpredictable to be just a heartbeat away from the presidency. He famously said, "Don't you realize there's only one life between that madman and the presidency?"
Wow. But New York political boss Thomas E. Platt actually wanted Roosevelt as VP.
Specifically to get him out of the New York governorship, where he was proving too independent and reform-minded for Platt's machine politics. Kick him upstairs, basically.
So McKinley ultimately went with Roosevelt, and they won a decisive re-election victory against Bryan. Another solid win.
Yep. Shortly after his second inauguration in March 1901, McKinley planned an extensive 6-week national tour. A victory lap, almost.
But Ida's fragile health, particularly an illness she suffered while they were in California, led to postponements, including delaying their planned visit to the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York.
His devotion to her really shaped his schedule. His personal secretary, George Cortelyou, was increasingly worried about the president's safety.
Why specifically?
Well, there had been a wave of assassinations of European rulers by anarchists around that time. Cortelyou tried, at least twice, according to the sources, to convince McKinley to cancel the public reception he planned to hold at the Exposition's Temple of Music.
But McKinley refused.
He did. He genuinely loved meeting people, shaking hands. He felt it was part of his duty, maybe. He just brushed off the concerns.
So McKinley delivered his final major speech on September 5, 1901, at the Exposition. And notably, he spoke not about past victories, but looked to the future, advocating for trade reciprocity treaties with other nations.
A move towards lowering some tariff barriers, which was actually a notable shift for the advance agent of prosperity who built his career on high tariffs.
Interesting evolution there. And then came September 6, 1901, the reception at the Temple of Music. Leon Czolgosz, an anarchist.
Motivated by the idea of killing a ruler, influenced by figures like Emma Goldman, though she later disavowed his act.
He was in the crowd. He had bought a revolver a few days earlier and had actually tried to get close to McKinley the previous day but was blocked. On the 6th, he wrapped his right hand in a bandage or handkerchief to conceal the gun, making it look like an injury.
A simple, tragic deception. As McKinley stood greeting the public line, shaking hands, Czolgosz stepped forward, extended his bandaged hand as if for a handshake, and shot him twice at close range with the gun hidden underneath.
Awful. McKinley's immediate reactions, according to the sources, were striking. First, concern for Ida, telling aides, "My wife, be careful, Cortelyou." How you tell her, "Oh, be careful."
Incredible presence of mind. And then, seeing the crowd starting to attack Czolgosz, he reportedly said, "Don't let them hurt him." Concern even for the man who had just shot him.
It's just amazing. He was taken to the aid station, set up right there at the Exposition. Doctors operated, found and treated the entry wound from one bullet, but couldn't locate the second bullet, which had lodged deep inside, likely in his pancreas or kidney.
And here's that detail from your sources that is just haunting. There was a primitive X-ray machine right there at the Exposition grounds being exhibited as a marvel of science.
Oh my gosh.
But for reasons that aren't entirely clear, maybe concerns about its safety, maybe lack of familiarity, maybe just the chaos of the moment, it wasn't used on McKinley.
Think about that. Potential chance to locate that bullet missed.
A huge what if. In the days that followed, McKinley seemed to rally. Doctors issued optimistic bulletins. Things looked hopeful.
leading cabinet members to dispose, and Vice President Roosevelt left Buffalo for a camping trip way up in the Adirondacks, believing the president was recovering.
Everyone thought the danger had passed, but McKinley's conditions suddenly and drastically declined on September 13th. Gangrene, infection from the unremoved bullet and the damaged tissues, had set in.
Just devastating.
He died in the early morning hours of September 14th, 1901. His last words were reportedly part of the hymn, "Nearer, my God, to Thee."
And Czolgosz's fate was sealed with astonishing speed. His trial began just 9 days after McKinley's death.
Swift justice, or perhaps injustice, depending on your view of the process. He was quickly convicted, sentenced to death on September 26th, and executed by electric chair on October 29th, 1901, just over a month after the shooting.
The nation's reaction was a wave of profound, genuine grief. People were shocked. The stock market even dropped significantly due to the sudden uncertainty.
It really shook the country. There were immense funerals and memorials lying in state in both Washington and Canton, drawing vast crowds. The numerous memorials built across the country, the statues, schools, streets named for him, they reflect the expectations, particularly strong among Ohioans at the time, that he'd be remembered as one of America's great presidents.
His historical ranking, however, as you look through the sources, is generally placed more in the middle tier, sometimes even below contemporaries like Hayes or Cleveland.
Yeah, historians debate whether he was more of a follower of public opinion than a leader who shaped it, and how our modern expectations of a president affect how we evaluate someone from that era.
He's undoubtedly seen as a key transitional figure, though, marking that shift from the third-party system to the Republican-dominant fourth-party system.
Absolutely. Interpretations of his leadership style vary. Some see him as primarily pro-business, others as a quiet reshaper of the presidency through figures like Cortelyou, or simply an agent of incremental change reacting to events.
There are strong arguments presented for placing him higher in the rankings, emphasizing his skill at coalition building, holding the party together.
And the caliber of the figures he brought into his administration who went on to shape Republican politics for years. Cortelyou, Charles Dawes, William R. Day, William H. Taft, who became president himself. He had an eye for talent.
And one very direct, lasting result of his assassination is specific. The Secret Service's role was officially expanded to include protecting the President of the United States.
Before McKinley, their main job was fighting counterfeiting. His death fundamentally changed presidential security.
The ongoing debate about his legacy often circles back to that territorial expansion and imperialism. The acquisitions under his presidency, Puerto Rico, Guam, the Philippines, are frequently seen as the real start of an American empire.
Right. And the question of his true motivations for intervening, especially in the Philippines and the brutal war that followed there, remains a subject of significant debate and criticism.
He's generally identified as a political conservative, and his administration's economic approach was largely laissez-faire, a limited government role in the economy, trusting business.
Pretty standard for the Gilded Age Republicans, but it's noted in your sources that scholars who really dig into him, study him in detail, often raise their estimation of him.
Oh, interesting.
They tend to see him as a more active, responsible, and informed participant in decision-making than his public image sometimes suggested. Despite what one source calls his subtle operations, that kept him somewhat remote from public perception during his time. As that source puts it, through detailed study, he's once again at the center of events where he started.
So wrapping this up, what does this all mean? We've taken a deep dive into William McKinley, a president whose brief time in office coincided with massive change and expansion for the United States, ending in just heartbreaking tragedy. We've explored the conventional narrative of his rise, the Ohio native, the Civil War veteran, the tariff champion, the devoted husband, the master campaigner, the wartime leader presiding over American expansion.
The standard story. And alongside that, we've looked at another perspective offered by one of your sources that asks us to peer beneath the surface, to consider if deeper, perhaps less visible, forces were at play behind key decisions and events. It raises questions about unseen pacts, conveniently timed catalysts, strategic maneuvers for unspoken motives, the influence of powerful commercial interests, and this idea of an unseen architecture of power.
This raises an important question for you to consider. Given McKinley's often deliberate and subtle approach to leadership and the incredibly complex events of his era, from massive economic shifts and territorial acquisitions to the very circumstances surrounding his death, including that, haunting detail about the unused X-ray, how much do we truly know about the driving forces behind the veiled presidency of William McKinley?
It leaves you with something to think about, doesn't it?